Thank you so much, Thea, and thank you for joining us for what I think is going to be a fascinating romp through biotech history and future with Edwin Moses, one of the leading biotech entrepreneurs in Europe. I'm Steve Dickman. I was a part of the last panel, so I'll keep the bio short. I'm a consultant in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm CEO of CBT Advisors. We do a lot of storytelling work with biotech entrepreneurs, and our clients hire us typically either at the early stage to work with them on storytelling and setting their companies up for future success through language and persuasion, but also with later stage companies drafting business sections for companies that go public on the NASDAQ. We've had almost 200 clients in this sector and had 90 clients do IPOs on NASDAQ and Euronext. I'd like to introduce you to Edwin Moses. Edwin is an illustrious entrepreneur who worked first in the UK and then now for the last 25 years in Belgium. First with Oxford Asymmetry in the UK, and then, of course, with Ablynx, from which he had a stupendous exit, bid up at the last minute by a new bidder, and from Sanofi. And we're pleased to have Edwin here, and we'd love to talk with him some topics about entrepreneurship and how biotech actually gets done in Europe and how it can get done better. And Edwin, I'd like to start by saying thank you for coming today, and that's a lot of names under your name on the tag. Can you tell us a little bit about these companies that you're now associated with now that you get to belong to several masters as opposed to just the board of Ablynx?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you for the invitation to appear here from Sachs. It's a while since I've had a romp, but I'll do my best to romp through this. The three companies are quite different. I think it's one of the real pleasures of going through different elements of your career. I've twice been a CEO over a 20-year period in two different companies, quite different sectors in the life sciences. In between time, I did a bunch of non-execs in discovery companies, in CROs, private equity-backed, learning different things from different groups. And now, after my Ablynx experience, I'm again chairman of these three companies. Achilles is a cell therapy company in clonal neoantigens, phase 2 clinical studies, NASDAQ quoted. LabGenius is in machine learning and AI, a small private company based in London, going through a Series B as we speak. And Avantium is a public company in Holland, really out of the normal, not something that most of you would be familiar with. It's in environmental chemistry. It looks like a biotech company in that you've got about 200 PhDs and very clever chemists, and what they're focused on is finding ways of developing from plant sustainable sources intermediates and plastics which are currently made from fossil fuels. Fascinating stuff, very clever chemistry in the lab, and then instead of doing a clinical trial, what they have to do is scale up and make 5,000 tons in a plant to prove that they can do it, to get the chemical industry and the brands to be interested. So what I like about this, before Stephen even asked me, is that it makes me stay awake in the day. I have to learn and learn and learn. When you're a CEO with one company, you get maybe even lazy. You know all about the stuff. You are the expert in that side. Here, I've had to learn these things from scratch. I knew nothing about cell therapy or environmental chemistry. So I find it fantastic that I'm allowed to learn about new things, meet new people, and hopefully contribute to them with my experience.
Well, I was going to ask about that. I just now for the first time learned about Avantium, and that scale-up process sounds expensive. So how do you bring your fundraising expertise to a company like that, where you're usually raising funds on hope and dreams, and they need to raise funds on actual productivity numbers?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is an interesting area because everybody wants to talk green. Everybody wants to say why they're going to go green. But if you're not producing the chemical or the plastic at the same euros per kilogram as you do from fossil fuels, nobody's interested.
Forget it.
And just like a biotech, showing that in the lab is all very well, but then all the large manufacturers, the packaging people, the Coca-Colas, the brands, the Heinekens, they look at that and say, yeah, but do that on a serious scale, do it on many thousands of tons. So that company, Avantium, has gone through a number of funding rounds. It's public, so it's raised equity finance, but also debt finance from a consortium of Dutch banks, again, using the political positive wins where the government is pushing the banks to support companies like ours. So taking advantage of a whole bunch of different financing mechanisms, which are quite different to those you find in biotechnology.
Okay, so now I understand the link. Because one of the things that you've told me in the past is that one of your secrets to success at Ablynx was that you saw the fundraising process as a kind of necessary evil for a CEO, having to go raise 20, 30, 50 million euro on an annual basis, basically being always on the hamster wheel. And you were able, through, I would say, some cleverness and some persistence, to change the way that biotech companies get financed and add a debt component where it really wasn't there before. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. So I think you're right. It's interesting when you pull the numbers apart at Ablynx. So Ablynx started in 2001. I joined the chairman in 2004, and the CEO was 2006. Up to that period, from that period to 2018, when Sanofi bought the company raised about 1.2 billion in finance. About half of that was in equity, with a portion of debt, and I'll come on to that. And about half of it was in actual cash from collaborators, not promises of cash, but upfront payments from collaborators. So that's how the split worked. And we eventually sold for about 4 billion. So that's how that worked. One of the, I think, the important innovations was during 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, we were raising cash every year. And we were using the mechanism in Belgium at that time of overnight book builds, where you could only raise 10% of your market cap. It's now 20%. But even then, our market cap was still quite low. It's 200 or 300 or 400 million. And 10 or 20% of that wasn't paying for our R&D expenses per year. So it meant that every time we raised cash, we'd go back out on the road and have to raise it again. And around 2014, 15, I began to talk to the banks, and I'd heard about convertible bonds, and quite frankly, I didn't even know what they were. I had to look them up and figure out what the heck they were. And all the banks said, oh no, convertibles aren't for you. You're a biotech company, and there've been some disasters in Europe. And of course, people always remember, and particularly in Europe, remember the disasters forever. So they come out with, oh, this company did a convertible and it was tragic. And I had to keep winding through that. And I think the key thing was not smartness, but persistence. I just wouldn't give up, because I thought, I don't understand why we can't do this. And in the end, one bank said, well, you could. Because you can see when the product that you're developing might get to market. You can use that as the horizon around which to build the convertible. And, well, let's do it. So all of a sudden, instead of having to raise 20 or 30 million, the convertible, without, and I feel ashamed to say this, but without hardly any preparation. So there was no prospectus writing. There wasn't a big deck being written. The amount of work was almost trivial in what you had to do. We raised 100 million euros. The number of roadshows I had to do were minimal, and what was happening was, this is all a question of striking at the right time. I'm not suggesting this would work today, but what was happening, there was a huge, big demand for parts of major institutions to get into biotech, but they weren't allowed to buy straight equity. So part of their institution might have brought equity in the company, but those debt-related parts of the institution couldn't do that like that. So we offer a convertible. They call up their mate who's down the corridor and they say, what's it like? Oh, they're a decent company. And that was the transaction done. So we raised 100 million in 3 days, I think it was. I practically did nothing. And we got a whole group of new investors into the company that were no trouble at all, but were looking to the future and the potential launch of a product. So that worked out extremely well. And all I'd say, the lesson from that is, don't take no for an answer. Keep pushing back. Look at the various creative forms of financing. And you may find ways that are special to you, like the political wins that we see helping us with Avantium in terms of getting the banks to offer debt facilities that they wouldn't normally do. Keep pressing and pressing and pressing, and you may find a door flies open for you.
So I'm starting to see that linkage between your biotech background and the much different fundraising requirements for a products company like Avantium. Thank you. I wanted to come back to Lab Genius because that fascinates me. So this is a UK company. It's raising Series B, did you say?
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about what this company does and how it does it.
Yeah, it really interests me. They've got an entrepreneur founder, a guy who was in college in London, Imperial College, doing PhD, and decided he wanted to set up a company. He's a fascinating guy. I call him my little Bill Gates. He's Mr. Charming. He's got the brain the size of a planet. My little joke is he's so charming, when he emails me, I show the emails to my wife because I think they're just so charming. So that's a very good start for a CEO. I'm
amazed that that's a success factor, but okay.
I wouldn't have thought so before, but he's very good at telling the story. But so what is he doing? He's using machine learning and AI to accelerate the speed with which you can develop protein therapeutics. So that's high level. And what are you doing in that? Well, what you're doing is designing very, very, very carefully experiments to build up a database, a very defined database, which allows you to predict a huge space of what proteins might do. So you might do work on, say, 200 or 300 molecules, actually make those, test them in a very, very careful way, build those data into your AI predictor, if you like, and then be able to predict the way in which 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 molecules would work. So you save huge amounts of time. But the big thing that struck me coming in from the outside was that they were obsessed with saving time in the discovery process. And many of you are involved in that. When I looked at it, they were coming from the outside of discovery. They were going to save you 2 or 3 months. Well, I wasn't going to go to the head of Roche or Sanofi and say, I'll save you 2 or 3 months in your whole discovery process, pay me a lot of money. That wasn't going to work. But when you look deeper into it, what they could actually do was find things that nobody could find using current methodology. And in fact, they just issued a joint press release with Sanofi on a project that they did, where that's exactly what Sanofi said that they had achieved. So what happens in normal drug discovery, as many of you know, is that all the very smart people in the organization have biases about what will work, what won't work. You know, group here will work. No, we never have a group there because the molecule couldn't be manufactured, blah, blah, blah. And that's what you pay those experts to do. In this approach, you take all that out. You don't allow the experts to bring any bias into the discussion at all. You just do the experiments and predict clean. Now, what I find very interesting about this approach is culturally, that's a real challenge to sell to big pharma, because you're having to say to people who have spent 20, 30 years building up these biases, which give them an advantage, no, we don't want to use that anymore. We're just going to actually design clever experiments and use those data. So it's not about robotics. It's not just about automation. It is about designing very clever assays and experiments. It's not taking data off the internet because that data is too rough and ready. But it's also a cultural change. And even within our company at LabGenius, we have a very good drug discoverer. And we had a program that didn't quite work in the way we wanted it to. And we suddenly found out he'd been putting his biases in. He decided that this thing here wasn't a group that we wanted in. So we said, no, the idea is we take that out. So we took that out, and suddenly we found a bunch of things that were very interesting again. So Sanofi has said they would have never found this molecule if we had not applied our technology to it. And that's what I find really fascinating.
So that's super interesting. I just want to make sure I understand. So maybe this is an analogy just for those of us who are still struggling with the AI and the ML. The Lipinski rules for what's a drug-like molecule, that's not exactly what you're talking about, but that is a type of bias that you look top-down and say a drug has to look like these 5 things. It has to have these 5 characteristics. And if this molecule doesn't have one or more of them, then it's never going to be a drug. Let's spend no resources on it. And what you're saying is you throw out the rules and you simply say, okay, what are the binding properties of this protein and that protein?
Exactly. And you can, in parallel, do 2 or 3 different characteristics. You build up a 3D model. And of course, in normal discovery, you never know where you're on the top of a mountain or in a valley. This allows you to actually see the entire terrain.
The fitness landscape.
Yeah, the fitness landscape, and predict, therefore, which molecules might be the best.
So I've got to observe, from having observed fitness landscapes for 30 plus years, that that's actually how evolution works. That evolution doesn't know what the pinnacle is going to be. It's just in a place, and it's got to move to a new place because there's pressure, and it just responds to the pressure. And that might be going up a slope, and it might be going down a slope to up to a better fit, or down to a worse fit. But if it's in a place where there's a worse fit, there's going to be more evolution. And what you're saying is the cycle times are short enough that this company can produce real results, even if it winds up in bad places occasionally.
Spot on. And you're taking that bias out where the guy says, I'm at the top of the mountain, and you're nowhere near the top of the mountain, and you can tell that with the technology.
That's amazing. I mean, obviously, the cycle times is the key, because they not only have this data, and they not only are able to manipulate the data, but they're able to do it so quickly that it actually doesn't matter if you have to do 50 more iterations, because that might just be a few weeks.
Yeah. And you're actually not doing that. You're doing 5 or 10 iterations.
Yes.
It's handfuls.
Just a handful. That's fascinating. So, I mean, I did want to stick with this for a moment because, you know, we're at a point in the financing evolution of the biotech industry where financing looks very difficult to find. It is very difficult. And the outlook looks bleak. The XBI is way down. And private companies, as we heard on the last panel, private companies are struggling to maintain even flat valuations. Flat is the new up, is what my panelists said. And so in an environment where things are so challenged on the outside, and when there are such promising, exciting new technologies coming, what do you think that's going to imply for the ability to finance these companies, and how do you think the markets will react?
I think it goes back to being creative. If I take this particular case as a point, Lab Genius, the individual, long before I got involved, started to hawk his idea around Europe to the life science investors. But it was a black box with algorithms in it, a lot of hand waving and mathematical phrases which people didn't really get. And so it got no traction at all in Europe. So as a smart entrepreneur, he got on the plane and went to the West Coast and found tech investors who understood exactly what he was talking about because they applied it to a much broader range of industries, got those people to help him get the initial funding, came back, found tech bio investors within Europe. So it was actually shifting around the investor group, and now we're moving towards life science investors as our next step who come in at this point. So it was just having someone who had the guts to say, well, I can't find the money here, I'm going to go and find it where people understand the story at this stage of evolution of the company.
So are there particular investors in Europe who you think are more open to these types of creative financing strategies? I mean, I think of Sofinova when you talk about this. They have operations here. They have many, many affiliates in the US, but maybe there are other investors. Do you see a landscape emerging where some investors in Europe are advantaged because they can think laterally and creatively?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, another reason for me taking this position was I got to meet a whole new group of investors. So there are people like Kindred, there are people like Atomico, they're names that I was not familiar with, but who crossed this landscape, this tech bio landscape. But I think you need people like that to help the life science investors and help the company actually position itself properly, because it's no good just waving your hand and showing equations. Life science investors are interested in assets. So what can you do with this platform? What can you create? And so the language of the company has to change as it develops through this whole range.
Language. So are you saying the company needs two different pitches, one for tech and one for bio investors?
I think the comment was made in one of the previous talks that could have 2 decks or 3 decks. I don't believe in that. I think it's having one deck but a different script and different emphasis on different parts of that script, and understanding, being careful how you don't overload your main part of your presentation with stuff which either cuts out tech people or cuts out life science people, and leave all that for the appendices of the people who want to dig into your data room. It's still, the overall proposition should be usable right across the investor range, but different investors will want to focus on different parts.
See, that's super interesting. I mean, I do investor pitches for a living, and I always struggle with the big difference between investors that are looking for financial feedback in the form of revenues and investors that are looking for more feedback at the level of innovation, at the level of this is a brand new type of molecule, or this is a molecule that addresses a disease that's never been treatable before. And so obviously investors invest billions towards untreatable diseases, and a lot of times they're investing on a kind of faith that tech investors or revenue-driven investors absolutely don't believe in. They have no faith whatsoever. They only want to see the bottom line. So how do you make a single pitch out of that?
I think what you have to do is let the tech, I think you're quite right about the difference in the investors, because not only do the tech investors want to see revenues at an earlier stage, but when you suddenly start talking to them about, oh, well, we need 10 million for an IND and we might get there and it might fail, they blanch at that point, because that's not a type of risk that is natural for them. So again, it's a matter of educating both different types of groups to say it's not all about quick revenue, it's not about keeping costs down to a minimum, it's about fulfilling the dream. If you want to access this upside of developing a drug, then you have to take more risk, find more money. And so it's all about blending investors on the board, which is key.
Well, it seems to me that then we've arrived at the answer, which is that you need to be a person who can persuade both types of investors to just trust you.
I think that's 100% right. And I think it's one of the things that, I was listening to the debate before about Europe and the US. I think that having raised money both in Europe and the US, what I notice most as a CEO and the chair of companies raising money is that the US basically backs the individual. I know it's a generic statement, but if they like you, if they believe in you as the CEO, then they say, well, here's 50 million, 100 million, go away and do it. Here in Europe, there's a nervousness. They're never quite sure, do they really trust you? So what do? They put in 4 tranches or 5 tranches. And then the poor management team is spending their entire time figuring out how do they prove that they've reached this tranche rather than trying to create the real value. I'm making sort of very extreme comparison, but I think that, yes, that is what I think a great CEO does, is get investors to trust them. Now, they have to do that not just through blind faith. They have to demonstrate the principle. They have to demonstrate it. I know that from being a CEO myself, what investors love the most is you go and see them in New York or Boston and say, I'm going to do this in the next 6 months. And you turn up 6 months later or 3 months later and say, I did exactly what I said. And whatever those things were, you begin to build up that relationship where what you says really matters. And they can trust that you're going to deliver on what your promise is. And if you don't deliver, you have a credible explanation why you didn't. But they don't want too many of those. There's got to be a limit of those. People's patience is short.
Well, I mean, I want to come back to the environment in which you were successful again and again at raising money for Ablynx. There were plenty of antibody companies, plenty of European unique technology antibody platform companies that arose in that time, and some of them have worked out incredibly well, and some of them, Genmab and Ablynx, and some of them have worked, Argenx, some of them have worked out less well, MorphoSys. And I just wanted to ask you, like, from your experience, what was it do you think that allowed your company to continually persuade investors to have that faith, to have that trust when they had other places they could have invested with other promising antibody platforms? What helped you stand out and maintain that trust?
I think a very simple one, which I say, and people sort of sneer a little bit sometimes, is shoe leather. You had to actually go there, walk the halls of New York and Boston, San Fran, wherever, and do it repeatedly as a European. You had to keep turning up in their face all the time, as you might do in Europe. And that was vital. I just pick an investor, Baker Brothers. Many of you will know them. They're sort of high in the echelon of investors. You would have to go there 4, 5, 6, 7 times. You'd be faced by 10 PhDs who knew the minutiae of whatever you were talking about. You'd be grilled to death. And then some point, boom, in they come and they say, yep, this is for me. And I can say that if I just take them as an example, when Sanofi, when the bidding was going on to buy Ablynx, Baker Brothers had already made a very significant investment in the company. They were the only investor who called me up and said, you know what, we spent all this time figuring out what the heck you're doing, where you're going. You don't want to sell to those companies, we back you. If you don't want to do that, we will back you all the way. And you don't have to sell. We will wait another 3 years, another 5 years to get that. They were the only ones. But it took 5, 6 years to build that trust up with them. It was not an overnight job. So I think, first of all, it's not quick. It's a long process. You have to invest a lot, be prepared to overcome a lot of other arguments about why you're not the ideal investment. If you take Argenx as a good example, Tim van Houwemaaren, who came from Ablynx and gone on to do a brilliant job, he went to live in the US for 6 months at least, took his entire family there in order to make sure that he got the feel of what US investors really wanted. So I did lots of plane trips. He went to live there. Different people took a different view. I think the other thing, I'm loath to criticize or say that some companies have done well and some companies have done badly, because you also need a lot of luck. But if I look at the MorphoSys story, and I think what Simon did there was excellent, and we're talking about that as not being too successful. It's still worth $1 billion.
And some of their drugs are approaching the market, and they're going to be very, very valuable.
I think if I look back and from the outside in, it was very interesting to us that Ablynx repeatedly had applications from MorphoSys development scientists to come and work for us, not because we're a better company, but because they felt that we were genuinely committed to developing our own drugs. And they didn't feel their own company was really prepared to go all in on developing their own drugs, and they wanted to try and share it and do it.
They wouldn't put their money where their mouth was.
Yeah,
and they partnered the good ones.
And their own employees could see that. So
you kept the good ones.
Yeah, we tried to keep what we thought was important, and I think that comes back to what the people value. If you look at the Sanofi acquisition, it's really interesting. Some of you got platforms. Platforms, in my view, are fantastic. I loved having a platform, but you need the assets derived from the platform to do it. When I got fed back, where did the 4 billion calculation come from what we were worth? It was about 2 billion for our lead asset, which has since been approved, and about 2 billion for the platform. But if there had not been the lead asset there, the platform would have been worth about 100 million. It was nothing like that. So you need the combination, and you see that in all these companies. They need to have the platform, they need to demonstrate it with an asset, and that's where the value driver really comes. And you see that with a whole bunch of the companies.
That's super interesting. I mean, we're going to wrap up in a minute, but I think the take home, the take home for me in learning about Edwin's illustrious career is that he was not willing to accept the first offer when Ablynx got a bid. And it wasn't just that you had the gut that, oh, this could be a better offer, this is a lowball offer, I don't have to take this, but it was the fact that you had spent years building trust with an investor who had a large share position in your company, who would be willing to back you on something as risky as turning down a multi-billion-dollar offer for your company. That's impressive.
Yeah, I think that was, and I think that reflects extremely well on them, on the way that they work and the trust that you can put in them. I think the other thing to say, just for the CEOs in the room, it wasn't me just sitting there thinking that number from Nova is not the right number. I thought that. But we'd spent 2 or 3 years working with investment banks to build up our own view of what our real valuation was. It's a frightening thing for a CEO to do, because when you go back to the board, and if I use the Ablynx share price just to give you an idea, we were oscillating between, say, 12 and 20. The bank's detailed assessment of what was worth was closer to 45, 50. So I have to listen to banks tell the board that. The board looks at me and says, so what the heck are you doing then? But you're less than half the value they say. And we said, well, then that's the ideal world. But what it meant was when the first bid came in, we had the board in a good position, because boards get nervous about saying no to offers that look attractive. They had a lot of documentation which gave them confidence that we could rationally say no. And I should say we also, one of our approaches, and I think this comes from my salesman background, was not only did we say no to Novo, but we wouldn't let them in the data room. And it drove them crazy. But we said, it's a bit like if they made an underbid for your car and they said, but I'd like to look under the hood. We just said, no, you can't even look under the hood. This bid is so, just not acceptable. You can't even go in there and look.
Excellent.
And that was, it gave quite a strong message, as you can imagine. But I think it helped us. It was also interesting as well, because there are very, very few hostile bids anywhere. It was the only hostile bid that had happened in Belgium for any country for 10 years, for any industry in Belgium for 10 years. Yeah. So the Banking Commission in Belgium had absolutely no idea how to handle it. Really, there was no one in the Banking Commission who'd ever experienced a hostile bid for a public company. So I actually got a call from the Banking Commission halfway through this, before it had been announced that they'd made a bid, but when they made private. And the guy said to me, Mr. Moses, yes, did you know that there is a company who likes your company? I said, well, there are lots of companies that like my company. Yes, but they really, really like your company, and they think you should take them more seriously. I said, it's none of your business until they put this into the public domain. But, I mean, they didn't know what to do, so that was the...
That's very funny. On that note, we're out of time. I wanted to thank Edwin very much for joining us. Thank you, Edwin.